Banishers Ghosts of New Eden is the latest game from AA publisher Focus Entertainment. Now, if you've seen the trailers, you're probably reminded of those first-party Sony games like God of War or The Last of Us, and I mean, those comparisons aren't unjustified. This is a third-person, narrative-driven adventure game. It's got that tight, over-the-shoulder perspective where you spend a lot of time running through linear corridors, squeezing through tight spaces, moving objects to climb ledges, all while you and your traveling companion bounce dialogue back and forth before you reach the next combat encounter. Now, obviously, Sony can't claim full ownership over these ideas, but it's clear nonetheless what Studio Don't Nod were going for here. And funnily enough, this isn't their first time doing this style of game either. You may know them as the studio behind the Life is Strange series, or most recently Jusant, but a number of years ago they released a lesser known game called Vampire. I did not play that game, but I couldn't help but notice how much Vampire's reviews echo my experience with Banishers. From what I can tell, that was a game with a thoroughly engaging story that allows for interesting moral decisions, but held back by its clunky combat and poor technical performance. Well, it seems history is doomed to repeat itself here, because that is Banishers Ghosts of New Eden to a T. This is a game with a very well-written story about loss, told through its protagonists Red and Antea, but most effectively through the tales of those you cross paths with along your journey. Between both the main quests and side quests, each of New Eden's citizens offer mysteries so captivating that the act of simply unraveling them was rewarding enough, but how you judge their moral dilemmas also meaningfully shapes the narrative. The excellent storytelling, however, wasn't enough to totally carry the experience for me. The game boasts impressive visuals for sure, but at a cost, as my experience on mid-range hardware was plagued by very poor performance. But perhaps the biggest downfall is the combat. While the gear system and skill trees offer a decent amount of agency over your playstyle, the fundamentals are so unwieldy and cumbersome that I always loathe to engage with it, with the extremely limited enemy variety doing it no favors either. So I find myself feeling very mixed towards this game. Did I have a good time with it? Kind of. I mean, this is a 20+ hour narrative-led game. There's a lot of dialogue, more than you might expect from a AA game, and all that stuff I really enjoyed. But then I'd hit the next combat encounter and I'd be reminded of just how sluggish the core gameplay is. Ultimately, this really depends on your tolerance for that sort of thing. If you're of the gameplay is king mindset, then I wager you drop this by the end of the first boss fight. However, if you're able to stomach the subpar combat, there's a myriad of intriguing quandaries and ghost hunting tales to experience here as you play the part of judge, jury, and otherworldly executioner.
The Banishers are here. Surely with their expertise we may yet prevail.
Life to the living, death to the dead.
Banishers Ghosts of New Eden follows the story of one Red McWraith. Yes, that is his real surname, and his mentor turned lover, Antea Duarte. They're banishers, hunters for hire with a taste for the incorporeal. In simpler terms, Ghostbusters. They've been called to deal with one such ghost haunting the town of New Eden, a freshly built settlement in the newly discovered land of North America, where citizens are attempting to make new lives for themselves. The Banishers underestimate the power of this particular target and get a little complacent. On confronting the ghost, Antea ends up dying, and Red is thrown into the sea. He wakes up sometime later down the coast, saved by a stranger, and in the throes of coming to terms with his lover's death, he ends up finding her as a ghost.
I have you.
You have me.
With this tragic irony in mind, the two must agree on a promise. The first of many critical choices the game will have you make: resurrect her with a ritual that requires the sacrifice of countless human lives, or part with one another for good by having her ascend. Regardless, either of these things will require her body, which is back in New Eden, guarded by her murderer, and so begins their journey. Now, firstly, I'll shout out the visuals. There's some really high production value on display here. Environments look quite nice, the North American landscape is dense with foliage, and the lighting at night looks particularly standout. You'll visit a few varying locations from swamps to farmland to snow-capped mountains, but those are about the extent of the visual diversity. I thought character models look especially fantastic though. There's some incredible detail here for a AA game. You can read even the most subtle emotions through their expressions, despite the lip sync itself not being all that great. Performance is questionable though. It was pretty choppy during my preview, as you'll see in some of the gameplay, though a recent patch seems to have fixed the brunt of it. On my laptop with an RTX 3060 and an AMD Ryzen 7 at 1440p with DLSS set to balanced, I get around 50 FPS on high settings, but dropping things to medium, I can get a reasonably stable 60 FPS. The real problem though are the regular stutters and frame drops. In certain sections of the game, my FPS would seriously chug, particularly when entering new areas, but also in combat, often dropping below 30 FPS on a high setting, sometimes dropping as low as 20, which didn't feel great at all. As expected though, it did fare much better on my PC with an RTX 3090 Ti and an i7 at 1440p, where I was able to get well above 60 FPS at all times at very high settings. PS5 seems to run the game pretty well too, with a steady 60 on performance mode and fidelity mode sitting at about 40 FPS. Performance seems to vary significantly, so I'd advise keeping an eye out for the inevitable Digital Foundry breakdown. In my experience though, that shaky performance on the mid-range laptop was a little concerning, so it's definitely worth keeping an eye on as reviews go out. Moving on to the story though, I thoroughly enjoyed the 20+ hour story of Banishers, in large part due to the characters. Red McWraith in particular is such a great protagonist. Both the writing and voice acting for him is just excellent. He's immediately got this charm and charisma about him, this warmness and politeness, with this very natural line delivery. He's a Scotsman, he's got that thick accent, the slang, the sarcasm, and it makes him an absolute joy to listen to.
Look at it. It's cold as a bishop's arse, and twice as white. I don't mind saying it, I'm very disappointed.
There's such a range of emotions he displays throughout the game too, from sadness to rage to humor. Maybe it's the accent, but I found him quite funny. He tends to make light of situations to keep morale high, but at the same time, doesn't overdo the japes. His best moments are these times of earnestness, where he's talking through his thoughts with Antea by a campfire, second-guessing the decisions that he, and by extension you, have made during this pursuit for peace. Antea, on the other hand, I think she lacks the same emotional range. She's the jaded veteran, and from the jump you get the sense that she's quite ruthless, has a no-nonsense approach to everything because of her experience, which does contrast well to Red, don't get me wrong. I think this works well when she's on the job, but she maintains this cold, distant tone toward Red as well. It'd be just fine if the two were unacquainted and needed to slowly open up to each other, but these two are supposed to be a couple. She says a lot of sweet nothings and niceties toward Red, but it's all delivered in this very monotone, almost insincere tone. And on that note too, despite literally being prepared to get married if they believed in such a practice, they don't seem to know much about each other. I mean, there's literally a conversation where Red reveals that he has a sister who Antea doesn't know about, and Antea has twin siblings who Red didn't know about either.
I've never met my brother and sister.
Wait, what?
Twins. By my mother's letters, they must be 8 years old.
You never told me this.
You never asked.
Red reveals that he hates crows, Antea fills him in on all the places she's visited. Obviously these things are kind of necessary so that the player can learn about these characters, but they didn't help to convince me that these two really know each other. Because of all these things, I feel like these two unfortunately lack any kind of chemistry, which is a shame given one of the core through lines of this story is that these two are prepared to risk everything, potentially slaughtering dozens of innocents if you choose, just to be with each other again. All that said, this so-so romance plot kind of becomes secondary to the true core of this narrative, the cursed characters of New Eden. This was my favorite thing about this game. This is a land filled with troubled characters, all running from something. All have made morally questionable decisions in the name of survival. There's a real commitment to this theme of loss, grief, one's relationship with death, the death of a lover, a sibling, a fellow countryman. Nearly everyone on this island is haunted by someone, but nothing is ever what it seems. Throughout the game, you'll come to realize that the role of a Banisher isn't just to kill ghosts, it's to deeply understand why they've manifested, how they've been wronged, and why they're attached to the person they're haunting. This holds especially true for the main villain. She's just a nameless murderer as far as you're concerned. She's killed your future wife, she torments the innocent, she's left this new town to ruin. That is until the plot expertly unravels the many ways in which she's been wronged by the leaders of New Eden, how their combined sins were the catalyst for this curse. What those wrongdoings were, I won't spoil obviously, but the way I dealt with each of these leaders had clear ramifications on the story, and I'd be genuinely curious to see the alternate outcomes.
And live, you both shall. Long enough to accept your guilt, and maybe to forgive yourselves.
Side quests are equally fleshed out. What often begins as a cut and dry whodunit almost always evolves into a more complex moral quandary. When it comes time then for you to play judge, it's often a very difficult decision to make because of how effective the characterization is here and how tangibly your actions shape Red and Antea. I will say though, the actual structure and gameplay of these stories is nothing to write home about. You're introduced to this haunting cases menu where you gotta piece together the motives of a ghost, find evidence, etc. It was a shame to find out that you're not really doing much of your own investigation here. You're not going around town asking the right people the right questions or carefully discerning clues from the environment. Instead, every one of these plays out almost identically. You talk to the person and select the highlighted dialogue, you go to their belongings and interact with them, you follow some trail to find the object the ghost is tied to, you summon them, you talk to them, then you go back to the person and you decide who's in the wrong. Both the main and side quests are structured this way, and while the ones related to the main plot will send you to more significant locations, that formula never really changes. And I mean, it's very linear. There's no alternate way to solve these cases. Oddly, there's this occasional mechanic where you can draw a summoning circle on the ground and can pick to either reveal a memory, manifest the ghost, and a few other options. I question the existence of this mechanic because there's only ever one correct option here. If you pick the wrong one, nothing happens. You just try again and pick another one. It's a missed opportunity, I think, to not make this a more flexible part of the investigation loop where you can gather the evidence out of order, choose to speak to the ghost, or even ignore them entirely to avoid complications. But I guess there was just a simpler vision here, and as a result, these cases aren't anything more than simple linear quests. It's a testament to the writers and voice actors though that every character I came across felt so deeply human with such captivating mysteries to unfold, to the point that it totally carried these quests for me despite the investigation loop being so sing-song. Each of these stories demands your individual attention, to the point where I would have gladly gone out of my way to complete all the side quests in this game if it weren't for the poor combat. So I won't beat around the bush. Combat in Banishers is not very good, to say the least. When playing as Red, you have the standard melee moveset, a light attack, heavy, dodge, parry, a banish finishing move when charged, and a single shot rifle for the occasional snipe. But then there's also Antea, who you can swap to at any time, provided you've charged the spirit gauge enough from landing attacks. She's got much faster light attacks, alongside a bunch of special abilities with various utility. Now, from the first moment I hit an enemy, I was like, uh-oh, something's not quite right here. Both the animation and sound design of hitting an enemy just aren't great. Enemies do flinch to your hits a little bit, but it isn't quite enough to feel the impact of each hit, and they'll occasionally just not flinch at all. It becomes a little more functional as the rest of your kit opens up and you get some sort of build going, but the fundamentals remain quite rough. I think what it really comes down to is the pacing of combat, which is just all over the place. God of War is an example of really solid combat pacing. The speed of each swing of the enemy's telegraphs, the time it takes for an enemy to recover from a blow, the distance of your dodges, the time it takes to close the gap, there's a real rhythm to it, a tempo through which all these mechanics and accompanying animations keep time. Banishers is not like that, despite how it may appear in trailers. It's chaotic, sporadic, it lacks that consistent tempo. Your light attacks and dodges are almost lightning fast, but have these awkward pauses after them, I assume to allow for enemy openings since there's no stamina system to manage. In jarring contrast, animations for your abilities like the heavy attack, your rifle smack, or any of Antea's abilities feel so slow, and your movement is reduced to an absolute crawl while charging them. I mean, it feels like playing as the Flash, but every so often you've got to retie his shoelaces. But also, he's got a stitch, so he's got to slow down every 5 seconds. It's a bit fiddly too, in the sense that there's very little parity between Red and Antea's movesets. Antea can't block or parry, as she doesn't have a ranged attack nor a heavy attack, so against certain enemies, it feels like an unnecessary button press to switch back into Red just to use those basic functions. She's supposedly stronger against possessed enemies, but the bonus feels marginal at best, especially if you've built into a playstyle favoring Red's moves, something we'll come back to. In this way, I kinda just used Antea to gap close with her leap ability, or to dump her spells where necessary. Speaking of enemies, there's only about half a dozen enemy types you'll encounter. None of them change your approach considerably. You will mostly just be fighting these lame humanoid specters of varying colors, every now and then coming against one that's possessed a body, like a wolf or a soldier. There's one that occasionally raises its guard while doing nothing else, just walking around, forcing you to break it with a heavy attack. There's another one that instantly dodges attacks without any tell and very little opening to land a hit, almost forcing you to use Antea's ensnare ability to stop him moving. All the combat arenas are just completely flat. There is zero verticality at play despite Antea's warping abilities. The only way to deal with enemies at higher elevations is to shoot them with your rifle. In isolation, these aren't bad mechanics, but given how clunky the melee combat feels in this game, how these slow abilities don't weave nicely into the flow of combat, dealing with these things just feels incredibly cumbersome. Bosses don't fare much better either. I mean, just look at this. There's no posture or stagger system either, so your options to shut down an enemy are quite limited. Some attacks can knock the enemy down, but as you see here, it just sends them flying wildly while putting them out of range. Parrying feels a bit useless too, given how poor enemy telegraphs are due to their non-distinct, sometimes literally half-invisible models with little reward for pulling off a parry, unless you've specifically built into it. I think the itemization and skill tree though are one of the better parts of this game. It's nothing crazy, there's no swappable abilities or anything like that, but there's enough significant passive bonuses here to meaningfully tailor your combat loop. There's obviously ones that increase the power of Red and Antea's abilities, bonuses for perfectly switching between them, extra forms of survivability, with some of these having trade-offs that really make you consider the benefits. I ended up with a glass cannon rifle focused build. Through a combination of the right gear and skills, I was able to reload my rifle when using the rifle smack. The next shot after a rifle smack would deal bonus damage, and I'd stack up even more bonus damage from each precision hit and enemy kill. It still looks admittedly janky in practice, but this did change the way I approached combat, and it was satisfying to see such a measurable increase in my throughput. The gear and materials economy also feels quite balanced, and it's integrated well with the side quest loop. You'll find these things in chests out in the world, but they're more reliably sold by vendors at a somewhat steep price, but these vendors are often victims of one of those haunting cases I mentioned. Solving cases is a great way to earn currency in general, but solving them in the vendor's favor will reduce their prices further. So that's a cool additional element you'll need to keep in mind when passing that final judgment. I get the sense Don't Nod might have bitten off more than they could chew here though. What with 2 characters to switch between, each with differing movesets, a bunch of skill trees, a gear and upgrade system, etc. They seem to have been chasing the same level of buildcraft and combat depth as a modern AAA action game, but at the cost of the fundamentals. The mere act of landing a hit, the timing of attack, attacks, the pacing, the movement, the enemy design. The stories of New Eden's characters are so good that I would have been totally content with a more simplified combat model, provided that the groundwork was tight and satisfying to engage with. Whether through overambition or otherwise though, these things have not been refined here, and it sadly resulted in me dreading almost every combat scenario, no matter how brief.
If you're to come back, if we're to use the ritual we spoke of, this is when it starts.
So that's Banishers Ghosts of New Eden. As you can see, a lot of mixed feelings towards this one. At $50 USD, this is a slightly discounted title. It's not available on Game Pass, but it's the kind of game I suspect to make its way on there. For now though, do I recommend it at that $50 price point? Look, if you can get it at a discount and crank the difficulty down, going into this with the intention of just experiencing an intriguing string of stories and characters, I do think there's a lot to appreciate here. This is a surprisingly meaty campaign with very well written side quests. But I do think the poor combat, the patchy performance, and the generally bland gameplay does weigh down the entire package. Despite the implied replayability of it with its interesting moral decision making and multiple endings, there's no New Game Plus mode or anything like that. So if you wish to see those alternate outcomes, you need to start again with your limited moveset, slogging through the early game combat that only marginally improves as your gear and skills open up. As I said in the intro, I think it really depends on where your priorities are when it comes to video games and what your tolerance level is when it comes to gameplay. For me, Banishers doesn't deliver that game feel polish that I expect from modern games, but I can't deny that I was enthralled by the mysteries haunting New Eden's citizens. So it's worth at least looking into. Watch some other reviews and see where this lands for you. It's available on PC, PS5 and Xbox Series consoles on February 14th.